All right, hello. My name is Owen Nelson, and today I'm going to be covering a few aspects of my Judaisms class that I found very interesting and would like to see covered more in everyday life and in high school especially. And throughout our class, we used Aaron Hahn Topper as a very useful source. They distinctively outlined why we should use the term Judaisms rather than just Judaism. Um, Jewish practices and beliefs have changed a lot over time, and several different forms still exist today, but the main one being Ashkenazi Jews. And due to these many different forms of Judaism and Jewish practices and beliefs existing throughout history, it's more accurate to uh, say Judaisms rather than just Judaism, since there's so many different forms. No, I never really realized this before I took this class. I just knew Judaism as just Judaism. I didn't know that there was different forms that existed throughout history. But that's not the main thing I wanted to cover today. The main thing that I wanted to cover was these three main themes and some examples of these three main themes, covering different places and time periods. Now, the three main themes that I wanted to cover was the oppression of Jews, a practice of Jews like kosherness, and the diversity of Jews. Now, the oppression of Jews is a big one, since throughout history, Jews have faced a wide variety of oppression in many different places. Three examples that I'd like to cover is the Holocaust, being queer today, and how it compares to previously, and how Jews have been moneylenders for Christians throughout the medieval periods. Now, we've all heard about the Holocaust. Typically it's taught in school, but it's not talked about that much throughout high school. It's a pretty brief lecture on the Holocaust, I would say, compared to how big of an event it was. However, this is a period in time that should be covered in order to prevent history from repeating itself, such as how many Jews would prefer that the Holocaust be called a Shoah rather than the Holocaust, which a Shoah in Hebrew means a catastrophe, because the Holocaust, saying Holocaust isn't really that accurate for describing what happened. Now, the Holocaust took place over in Germany after World War I, when Hitler was coming into power, claiming that the Jews were their problem for losing the war. He used them as a scapegoat. But as the Jews in this time period slowly started to lose their rights, they had a mass migration to America. While America was better than Germany, there was still a lot of oppression that the Jews had to face in America. Because at the time, after World War I, Americans were facing the Red Scare within America. And this made a lot of the foreigners appear sinister. So the Jews were targeted as one of these foreigners because they were far left and commonly grouped with the communists. And at this time, even Henry Ford was targeting Jews. He republished 500,000 copies of the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, which, if you don't know what that is, it was written by the Russians to have this conspiracy behind the Jews that they were planning for basically world domination, which they weren't. This was just something that the Russians did to make the Jews look bad. And at this time, even the KKK added the Jews to their list, their targeted list, amongst the blacks that they were already targeting and Catholics. And also at this time, the Johnson Act of 1924 restricted all immigration from Eastern and Southern Europe to a trickle. At this time, the Jews were facing oppression from almost all groups. Most of that was relatively broad that I just covered. How about something more specific, like Jews and being queer? Now, the Orthodox movement does not permit queer-identified Jews to be ordained, but some liberal modern Orthodox communities welcome queer-identified Jews. The Reform movement began accepting gay and lesbian Jews into the rabbinical school in 1990 and openly bi and transgender students in 2003. In 2000, movements allowed Reform rabbis to officiate same-sex marriage. The conservative movement began accepting gay and lesbian rabbinical students in 2007 and sanctioned same-sex marriage in 2012. Reconstructionist Seminary began accepting openly gay and lesbian applicants in 1984. Humanistic Seminary has always accepted queer Jews, and in 2004 movement officially resolved to support same-sex marriage. It has been known for quite a while that the Torah teaches about gender fluidity, but through these recent movements has been accepted by many organizations. Now, I wanted to cover the oppression of Jews in the medieval period. Now, in the medieval period, Jews were living amongst a lot of Christians, and the Jews occupied very few jobs in Europe in the medieval period. They often worked as moneylenders, though, since Christians were not permitted to do so. Jews actually did find this profession very useful since it was portable, which helped when they were expelled from certain places. It was also profitable, since Jews were typically taxed higher than their Christian neighbors. They found this that this allowed them to survive since it was a very profitable job. So Jews needed the money lending because of this oppression, but because of this profession, Jews picked up the stereotype of being greedy. This stereotype still lives today, that Jews are a greedy group of people. Now, this isn't true, since moneylenders, when whoever you lent the money to doesn't pay, you have to go ask them for their dues, and this just made the Christians that were being asked for their dues criticize the Jews of being greedy, which formed the stereotype that lives till today. And to get past all this oppression of Jews, how about something a little more lighthearted? Now, I wanted to cover a particular practice, this practice being like kosher food, and how Jews have kind of changed how they follow the kosher outline from the kashrut. After moving from the big migration to America, they began assimilating, and through this assimilation, they've kind of changed how they follow these kosher rules. In the kashrut, there's outlines of what makes something kosher, and when Jews were moving to America and assimilating, they wanted to get like all the benefits of what was in America, but they also wanted to stay like good Jews. They wanted to still follow kosher rules. So there was like two main things that the Jews did. They would either keep a kosher home and eat non-kosher foods in restaurants, but other Jews would enact a kosher style system with Jewish tastes and flavors and some adherence to rules, but not strictly. So they could get basically all the benefits of the good food in America while following kosher rules or kosher style. And through this, food became the main site for Jewish fights about class, immigrant status, religion, generation, and gender. As Jews wrestled with assimilation and Americanization, their battles often involved food. How about the diversity of Jews? Jews often held very different statuses of power throughout history. Many times they were oppressed, but Jews actually often held positions of power. Another example that I wanted to cover was the diversity of Jews throughout history. Now, Jews have seen a lot of oppression in many different places in many different time periods, but that's not to say that they've always only faced oppression. They've also had positions of power in different places, such as the one writing that I had to read for class. I covered Australian Jews, and they actually happened to have actually a great deal of power around the same time period that the Jews were being oppressed in America. They actually had political power, and they actually made up a majority of the specialized jobs in Australia. The only thing that was stopping them for gaining political power at the time was they had to swear an oath on the Christian Bible, which many of them did not want to do, but after a while they ended up doing it in order to get this position in political power. But I'd like to talk about a couple other places. Like in China, there was a Jewish group in China that we know very little about. But from a 1489 inscription, we've learned that they came from India as cotton merchants. And at this time, cotton cultivation was just beginning. And it's a little odd that there's so many different groups of Jewish people, and we only know so much about certain groups. Jews in Mexico were being oppressed centuries ago. However, this was not a new idea at the time. England expelled all of its Jews in 1290. France followed with massacres and expulsions in the 14th century. Spain expelled Jews in 1492. So as it can be seen, Jews often face very diverse conditions throughout history. They've held power, some we know very little about, and many being oppressed. But Jews have existed in many different places throughout history, many more than I just listed off. But everything I have just covered I previously knew nothing about. But I wish it was more readily discussed amongst people, and I wish people knew a lot more about Jewish history and what they've faced throughout history, and that it's not always just oppression, but it can be something that we don't have much information about, and that we know very little about. And there's also a few places where we've seen that Jews actually hold a lot of power, unlike what's common in American history.